So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Vallance. Jeff holds a prestigious CRC Canada Research Chair. He's an associate professor at Athabasca University, where he works in the Faculty of Health Disciplines. Correct? Correct. Faculty of Health Disciplines. Jeff's also an Alberta Innovates Health Solution Population Health Investigator. Jeff has 2 degrees from the Faculty of Physical Education and Recreation, 2 quite different degrees, a master's degree and a PhD. Jeff and I actually studied together here for some time. I won't go too much into his career background because, of course, Jeff's going to do that today. So it's a great pleasure for me to have someone who's had such made such important strides in his career, doing really important work, to come back and talk to us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Vallance for the PER Alumni Speaker Talk.
Thanks, Nick. Well, it's an honor to be here in a faculty amongst colleagues that I hold in such high esteem and high regard. So thanks, Nick, for having me. So if you're over 30, you're probably humming the song, "I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For." If you're under 30, you're probably thinking, "I don't know what song that is." Well, if you were born in the 70s or the 80s, you might know these guys are the greatest rock band in the world. They're called U2, and they sang that seminal song, "I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For." And for me, it kind of sums up my research career to date. We go down the road, we answer research questions, and typically we end up wondering a bit more about what it is that we're doing, and we have more questions than when we started with. So I've got to come clean. This picture down on the left is actually taken in 2004, and it's 2016. I don't look that much different, do I? So if you go down the hallway there, you'll see it's the same picture, so I didn't want to try to hide anything. But so a little bit about myself. I think Nick summed up my credentials and where I work, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I do. And my passion is exercise and cancer and physical activity and cancer. I have a few different sub-interests that fall under that domain. I'm interested in how active and how sedentary are cancer survivors. And I'm also interested in what is the best way that we can measure these different behaviors. Typically what we've done is we've used self-report. Now we have much better ways of analyzing and measuring these behaviors, for example, with accelerometers. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And finally, I'm interested in how do we get these populations, cancer survivors, other chronic disease groups, different tumor groups within the cancer domain, how do we get them to be active? And I want to start by telling a story. This picture was taken back in, I believe it was around 2003 or 2004. Kerry had just launched the START trial, which was the supervised trial of aerobic and resistance training for women who were receiving chemotherapy for breast cancer. And I parachuted into Kerry's lab, and Kerry said, "You're in charge of this trial." I said, "Well, what's a trial?" But anyways, he threw me, it was kind of a baptism by fire. So what I did is I would go to the Cross Cancer Institute and I would recruit for this study. So these women were coming into our Behavioral Medicine Fitness Center, and I think a lot of you probably know where that facility is. They were coming in 3 days a week and having supervised aerobic or resistance training for the time that they were receiving chemotherapy for breast cancer. This is the first time that anybody had done this before. So the first individual I recruited was this lady right up here, and I'll never forget her name. Her name was Malvine Aird. And at that time, she was 79 years old. You can tell she's overweight, but she had a very aggressive form of breast cancer. She had several high-risk features. Typically, if you're over 70, they don't give you chemotherapy because you're too old, and they think that you can't handle it. But because of the nature of her tumor, they decided to try her with chemotherapy. And so I went in and sat down after they do the new patient consult, and I proceeded to sign her up to the trial. And lo and behold, she was randomized to the resistance training group. Now, when I met her for baseline testing, that included doing max VO2 tests, doing a DEXA scan, doing some strength, 1 rep max tests. I met her at the DEXA scan, which is over in human nutrition, and we started walking up the stairs, and about 6 stairs up, she had to stop and kind of take a break and catch her breath. And I thought, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? This lady can't even walk upstairs. So anyways, about 2 days later, she finally got through all of the the battery of the different exercise tests that we were doing. And she went into this resistance training group. I thought we were doomed because I didn't think she was going to be a good participant. Anyways, she had 6 months of chemotherapy. So you can do the math, 3 times a week, 6 months, that's about 80 or 90 different sessions. She had 100% adherence rate. She did not miss one session. But through my undergrad and through my master's degree, you learn a lot in textbooks. You don't necessarily get out onto the front lines and work with people like this. You typically read about it. But this was the first time that I could actually see somebody who was so deconditioned with a chronic disease and see the difference and the power that exercise had. And so from that moment, I was kind of hooked. I was hooked onto the role of exercise and the role of sedentary behavior and how that can impact people who are facing, quite frankly, a very terrible situation. So I'm not going to give you the whole Cochrane review of why exercise is good for cancer survivors. I'll just highlight a couple studies which I think give us a really strong rationale for examining this specific behavior in this cancer context. So the 2 graphs I have here, they're published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Holmes and colleagues back in 2005. And this was the first study to show that breast cancer survivors who are active had a reduced risk of their cancer coming back, and they also had a reduced risk of dying from cancer. Now, since then, it's been about 11 years. We've got a multitude of studies that have shown similar results, but this is the first time that we've seen this type of research question. Now, the nice thing about this talk is I don't have to explain what a MET value is, because I probably still can't do it. But if you look at the middle column there, the 9 to 14.9 METs per week, that's equivalent of 3 to 5 hours a week of moderate intensity walking. And it was that group that demonstrated the strongest associations with the recurrence and the mortality outcomes. A couple years later, Melinda Irwin at Yale reported that women who stopped exercising from the time that they were diagnosed had a 4 times greater chance of dying down the road than women who maintained their activity or improved their activity. So we've got some real strong and powerful clinical outcomes that are associated with exercise and activity in this population. So this is my first authored publication. And who here has a first authored publication? Oh my goodness. You could probably all remember the first one that you had. It feels pretty good, right? So I hold this one kind of near and dear to my heart. This is the first study I did in Carrie's lab. Carrie and I came up with the idea to do some research looking at exercise in the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma population. I'll refer to it as NHL, as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is a bit of a mouthful. It's typically a younger person's disease. The average age is around 40. It's not what we would call a little old lady cancer, for somebody who's diagnosed, with some of the cancers where they get later in life. So in this study, we did a population-based mail-out of Albertan non-Hodgkin's lymphoma survivors. And they filled out our survey, which asked them questions about physical activity, their cancer diagnosis, and their health-related quality of life, and different outcomes like fatigue. And this was the first study that showed that physical activity is related to health-related quality of life and fatigue in NHL survivors. And we looked at the data interestingly here. We divided the group up into people who were meeting physical activity guidelines, so 150 minutes a week, versus people that weren't meeting physical activity guidelines. And we were able to show statistically significant and clinically important differences in quality of life and fatigue between those 2 groups. So that was published in Psycho-Oncology. So my first authored publication. Because of that, I think it's also one of my most important. So some of my lab mates, and I'll talk about them probably more in my next talk, my other lab mates did some similar studies looking at different tumor groups. So Tina Carvinen did endometrial cancer. She also did bladder cancer. Lee Jones did multiple myeloma. And what we found was a similar trend that was happening with respect to their physical activity behaviors from the time that they were diagnosed to the time that they're into their survivorship. The first bar, the blue bar, I know the color doesn't show up very well, but that's them recalling their physical activity behaviors before they were diagnosed. And then the green bar is them recalling their activity behaviors during their treatment. And then the red bar is their current physical activity status, which is as a survivor, the time that they're filling out that questionnaire. And you can see the trend across the different tumor groups. When they go through their treatments, their physical activity levels substantially decline. And often, even when they're into survivorship, those levels don't get up to what they were doing before they were diagnosed. So because of this mounting data that we were getting on the really dismal physical activity rates that cancer survivors were engaging in, I started to get interested in what are some of the ways that we can encourage, facilitate, or promote physical activity in cancer survivors. And I got interested in breast cancer survivor. One of my aunts was diagnosed with breast cancer, so it had touched my family. So what I did is we developed a physical activity resource that was geared specifically for breast cancer survivors. We looked at what was available out there. This was going back to 2005, 2004. The internet wasn't as big as it was right now, so even online there really weren't a lot of resources for physical activity that were geared specifically to cancer survivors. So we set out to develop one of the first empirically based and theoretically driven activity resources or guidebooks for breast cancer survivors. And if you go to your doctor's office now, you might see a exercise pamphlet or a fat and fiber pamphlet. We took the approach of really having a method to our madness. And we took all of the literature that we had in terms of what we knew about breast cancer survivors, what types of activities they were interested in, the counseling preferences that we had, and we formulated that all into a nice guidebook. It was about 60 or 65 pages, and we framed it within the theory of planned behavior, which is one of the social cognitive theories for understanding why people are inactive or inactive. And it actually led to a bit of a side interest that I had in looking at different health-related print materials. And so we did another little study down here that was published in Patient Education and Counseling. And what we did is we went online, we contacted different organizations like Heart and Stroke, Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation, and we asked them to send us their resources. And what we did is we did an assessment of them using what's called the Suitability Assessment for Materials, the SAM for short. And that assesses things like readability, formatting, is there enough white space, what's the font like? There's actually a theory that goes into graphic design, and what we found is that the overwhelming majority, about 80%, were highly inadequate when it came to these attributes for these different resources. Now, like I said, keep in mind, you're probably thinking, why are we talking about print? Print is dead. This was in 2004, 2005. Print was still one of the main ways of communicating health-related information. So we took that breast cancer guidebook and we implemented it into a randomized control trial. And this formulated the basis for my dissertation work that I did with Carrie. This was called the ACTION trial, the Activity Promotion Trial. And we took roughly 400 Northern Alberta breast cancer survivors. We recruited them through the Alberta Cancer Registry, and we split them up into 4 groups. One group just received, was kind of our comparison control group, received just a standard verbal recommendation to exercise. One group just received the print materials alone. The third group received a pedometer. Everybody knows a pedometer is the little gadget you put on your waist, counts your steps. And then the fourth group received a combination of the print material and the pedometer. So this is one of the first studies to examine what we call a distance-based approach to promoting physical activity in a group of cancer survivors. There have been a couple studies that have done before this. However, they used a mixed sample of cancer survivors. This is the first one to specifically look at a large sample of breast cancer survivors. This was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, and what we found was quite interesting. We can see that the group receiving a pedometer, as well as the group receiving the pedometer, as well as the print resources we developed, they reported, and I know that doesn't show up very well, but about 87 to 89 minutes of physical activity after the 12-week intervention, compared to about 39 minutes in that standard recommendation group. And that was a statistically significant difference when we're comparing the groups. And then what was really powerful is we were able to link that change in behavior to a health outcome. In this case, we did it with health-related quality of life and fatigue. But I just have the quality of life graph up there right now. We saw a 7-point change in quality of life in that combined group, and that's what we would expect. And that's what we would deem as a clinically important difference. That change in 6 or 7 points on that health-related quality of life scale is what a doctor or a patient would determine as being clinically meaningful. So that was published in 2007. Let's fast forward 8 years. Carrie and I diligently worked to get that guidebook out to the public. And after many, many years and many, many failed and repeated attempts, we finally found a publisher, and that publisher was Lone Pine Publishing. You might not know that name, but you might know the group that does the Company's Coming cookbooks, and that's Lone Pine Publishing. So they took our book, and of course they massaged it all, and we had to add it up and add some content and beef it up a bit. But Carrie and I, just about a year and a half ago, were able to publish Fight Breast Cancer with Exercise, and that was largely based on the work we did in the ACTION trial. And you can get this on Amazon, Chapters, PharmaSave, Superstore. I was really excited for Carrie to get his first royalty check back in October, because I told Carrie I'm going to be the first graduate student to repay all the RA money that he gave me over the 4 or 5 years I worked with him. Still got a ways to go, I think, though, Carrie. So we've looked at this distance-based approach to promoting health in breast cancer survivors. We found some really interesting and exciting results. The second step was to take that model and apply it to women who are going through treatment. Because of the work that Carrie and I did with the START trial, that randomized trial looking at aerobic and resistance training during chemotherapy, the results were very exciting. We thought, let's give this a shot, let's give this a try in this very particular population. This was the first CIHR operating grant I received. I think it was back in 2008 or 2009. And this was for what we called the proactive trial, the promoting activity during chemotherapy trial. You can tell I'm not very creative when it comes to the acronyms for generating, shortening the study titles. What we developed here was what was called the proactive resource kit. And we built off the original guidebook that we did. We developed a couple more resources. The one on the right here is called the Step Into Survivorship resource. And that was specifically a resource that was geared towards stepping and counting your steps and monitoring your steps. Then we also developed a physical activity journal, so something that they can log every day, what it is that they were doing, the steps that they took, the amount of moderate and vigorous minutes that they did as well. So after about 4 years, we were able to recruit about 95 people, and we randomized them to the two groups. One group received a proactive kit. The other group only received a very generic Public Health Agency of Canada guide to being physically active, so not targeted or tailored in any way. I'll say the results were disappointing, but hear me out a sec. We found essentially nothing. We found that this proactive resource kit did not do anything for these women. There was no changes in activity, there was no changes in steps throughout the duration of their chemotherapy. Now keep in mind, these people are on trial for anywhere from 4 to 6 or 7 months, so they were engaging in the pedometer and the workbook materials for that amount of time. And we didn't find anything, but I think what it goes to show here, and what we conclude in the article, which was published in Cancer Epi Biomarkers and Prevention just about 4 or 5 months ago, was that for women going on chemotherapy and receiving chemotherapy, I think we need to do a lot more than simply handing them some print resources or giving them access to a website or an app. It's a very challenging time. Their body goes through immense challenges and changes, and we need to do a much better effort at facilitating and getting these women to be more active during their chemotherapy, because we know what the benefits are. So all of the work up to this point that I had done had been looking at self-reported physical activity and physical activity or walking assessed by a pedometer. In the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a large influx of research teams using what we call an accelerometer. And I know Val Carson back there has a lot of experience using accelerometers. They're little gadgets that go around your waist, just like a pedometer, but they give us much more sensitive and much more detailed information. Every second of the day, they can tell us how active somebody is. They can tell us how sedentary they are, if they're doing light intensity activity or moderate or vigorous intensity activity. So you can imagine you've got those 4 variables and you're getting a reading every second of the day. You've got literally 50, 60, 70,000 data points. So we found a way or an algorithm to condense all that to give us a meaningful value. So for example, minutes per day. And we also get a really interesting picture of how active these people are, literally a picture. And this is what's called a heat map. So all of that data from the accelerometer is condensed down. Sure, we get our outputs such as averages, but we can also generate these heat maps. And I just have three up here right now to show you the difference between the three types of people. So case 1 is an exerciser, case 2 is a couch potato, and case 3 is an active person. So with the accelerometer, if you're getting between 1,500 and 2,000 counts per minute, you're deemed as being very active at a moderate or vigorous level. When you're down to 0 or in between 0 and 100, you're largely sedentary, you're not moving. So you can see this exerciser, they've got a lot of moderate to vigorous activity interspersed throughout their day. There's very little periods of blue. The couch potato here is somebody that probably drives to work. They sit at an office chair, they sit at an office job, and then they drive to work home, they eat, and then they watch TV and they go to bed. You can see there's no yellow, no orange, no red. There's no movement going on there. And then for the active person, that's probably somebody that they're doing a lot of light activity. Maybe they don't have a sitting job, but maybe they're standing around and walking. Maybe they're puttering around doing their daily activities. And there's a little bit of exercise or activity interspersed as well. But you can see a lot of the sedentary behavior is broken up with these periods of activity. So we wanted to take this technology of using these accelerometers and apply it to the cancer population because it hadn't been done yet. So my good colleague and friend Bridget Lynch, she's down in Australia with the Victoria Cancer Council. She was one of the first to explore objectively assessed physical activity and sedentary time in breast cancer survivors. So she used data from the NHANES study, which is the big population data set down in the US. It's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And she isolated all the people that had been diagnosed with the breast cancer. And this is what she came up with. People who are doing MVPA, in terms of their total day, 1% of their total day was engaging in MVPA. 31% of their day was engaged in light intensity activity, and the overwhelming majority, 68%, were sedentary. This is not that different from what you'd see in the general population, but that 1% equates to less than 10 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Tells a bit of a different story from our self-report estimates from the studies that we've done before, which suggests that they're getting anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes of MVPA a day. So you can see the different numbers we're getting with these better measures that we have. So Bridget and I, along with our colleagues David Dunstan and Neville Owen, they're all down in Australia, we decided to write something up. What we want to do is we wanted to propose a bit of a research agenda and encourage people interested in cancer survivorship and researchers engaged in cancer survivorship resource, encourage them to start considering this whole concept of sedentary behavior. Because as you saw in the previous slide, it takes up over 60% of somebody's day, and we need to consider the health consequences of that large chunk of time. This was published in Cancer a couple years ago. And from there, Bridget and I and Carrie helped us out as well. We went to a group of colorectal cancer survivors, and we had about 170 of them, and they each wore an accelerometer. And what we found here was that 15% were achieving the moderate to vigorous physical activity guidelines, so that's 150 minutes of MVPA a week. Now, one of the advantages with the accelerometer is that you can chunk minutes of physical activity together. You can isolate the longer durations of time that somebody's engaged in that activity. So for example, an intentional exercise session, we'll see that orange and that red for a longer period of time, and we're able to isolate that. So we can restrict the data to only give us time in 10-minute bouts. So all of that little incidental, running to go to the bathroom or running a minute because you got to catch your ride, we can eliminate that, and we can only look at the time spent in MVPA for longer periods of time, and in this case it's 10 minutes. And when we only look at the 10-minute bouts, we find that only 9% are achieving those MVPA guidelines. Again, 61%, it's not I guess it's just a coincidence that that's the same as the previous research that Bridget did. And interestingly, we found that sedentary time was not associated with health-related quality of life. My data is not suggesting that. There's some data out there that's been published in the last couple of years that is suggesting that it is indeed related to quality of life and fatigue. So we still have a lot of more work to do to tease out these different associations. Now, one disadvantage with that accelerometer is I can be wearing it right now and standing, and it's going to count me as being sedentary. But I'm actually standing, and we know there's some data out there right now to suggest that standing is better than sitting. So we need to get a little bit more precise, and what we're doing with a group of prostate cancer survivors in Washington and in Australia is we're going to have them wear what's called the ActivePal device. And an ActivePal is an inclinometer. You wear it on your thigh, you put tape over it, and it can detect if you're sitting or if you're standing. So instead of just getting a generic value for sedentary time like we do with the ActivePals, we can now look at sitting versus standing. So we're just getting much more detailed in the behavior that we're looking at. So that kind of wraps up the cancer survivorship research that I've done up to this point. We've got a few things going on, but I just wanted to highlight some of the other work that I'm starting to do in different chronic diseases or chronic illnesses. So the first one is our first kind of foray into kidney transplant recipients. And this is an example of one of my former graduate students. She's graduated now. She was a thesis student. Totally taking you on a different direction. And she was a renal RN. And she was interested in the impact of walking and physical activity on kidney transplant recipients. And so we published her master's thesis, and I know that's really small, but I wanted to get it on there, in the journal Transplantation Proceedings, and we found that steps were significantly associated with physical function and physical wellness. And we have a study, kind of a phase 2 from that study, which we're doing here out of the U of A with a couple nephrologists over in Department of Medicine, and we're gonna use accelerometers, and we're gonna send accelerometers out to people who've had a kidney transplant in the last couple years in northern Alberta. So we'll start to get a little bit more sensitive in measuring these different behaviors and seeing what types of health associations there are. We've started to do a little bit of work in the area of gestational diabetes. Steve Johnson, who's somewhere in the back there hiding, is a good colleague of mine. I've known Steve for, gosh, we're coming up on 10, 15 years now. And Steve is a diabetes researcher. We're in the same faculty, and we're starting to look at gestational diabetes. So similar to what we did with that cancer research agenda and sedentary time publication, we took a similar approach and did one for gestational diabetes. And that was just published a couple months ago in the journal Endocrine. One of my good colleagues over in Rehab Med is Trish Manns, and we started to look at people who have had a stroke and they have a bit of a mobility impairment or a mobility issue. And so we've got accelerometers on these people, and we're starting to look at the sedentary time that these people are engaging in. And we published some interesting results in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. And then depression. Depression is often a consequence of a lot of these chronic diseases. And so we don't want to ignore depression. And my colleagues in Australia and I, just a few years ago, published the first paper looking at objectively assessed sedentary time and depression incidence. What we found is that the people who were more overweight were either overweight or obese. Those were the people that had a much higher risk of a minor or major depression diagnosis compared to healthy weight individuals. So just a snippet of some of the other things that we're doing. Okay, so back to U2. Some of you might still be singing the song. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Well, what is it that we're looking for? We know that the new measurement methods are telling us a completely different story than what we were getting with our self-report surveys and our pencil and paper surveys. So with the accelerometers and the inclinometers, we're getting a much better idea of how active these different groups are. You know, and when you think that 11% of colorectal cancer survivors were active, or 9% of breast cancer survivors were physically active, it's not encouraging, and it's even more discouraging when you consider that in these studies you likely have a selection bias, and the people coming into these studies are probably even interested in physical activity, but we're still getting this substantially low prevalence of these health behaviors. Survivors are still largely inactive despite the large body of evidence we have now for physical activity, and not just cancer, but for other chronic diseases such as diabetes. Despite everything we know that people who are active will live longer. We know that they have a less chance of having their cancer come back. We know what it can do for fatigue. We know what it can do for different chemotherapy-related symptoms. But we still find that the large majority of these individuals are not active enough to get those benefits. Our interventions, especially post-treatment, they're modestly effective at best. And when you consider the long term, when we do a 4 or 6 month follow-up, we literally find that we're back to square one. So we need to do a much better job at our interventions. We need to rethink the types of interventions that we're delivering. I think we need to get away from the one-off interventions of, having a 12-week website trial and have people in that, or a print materials trial and have people in that. We need to start thinking of some more creative ideas or some different strategies, some more upstream strategies to getting these populations active. And again, it's dismal when you think that the people coming into these trials, they're motivated, they probably know a little bit about exercise, and they're keen to be active. But like I said, the effects we're seeing from these trials are modest at best, and they diminish over a fairly short period of time. So quite simply, to sum it up, we need better initiatives, research initiatives, and better strategies. Now, I'm happy to be involved in 2 strategies that I'll highlight for you today. The first is what's called the Change Cancer Alberta study, and that's a study looking at metabolic syndrome across the province. And we're delivering this study in 16 different primary care networks. And so we've got teams of dietitians, kinesiologists, mental health experts, and it's a lifestyle intervention that's being delivered through the PCN across the province. I'm responsible for the accelerometer assessment in that study, so we're going to have a really nice data set of objectively assessed physical activity sedentary time in that population. And then the second one I'll highlight is called the AMBER study, and that's led by Carrie Kearney and Christine Friedenreich. I'm really lucky to be involved in that one, and what we're doing here is we're building a large cohort of people who have been diagnosed with breast cancer, and we're following them up to 5 years post-diagnosis, and then looking at clinical outcomes such as recurrence and survival down the road. This is the first time that we're going to get real gold standard assessments, so DEXA scans, fitness testing, things like blood draws and health-related quality of life assessments. So we're going to have a really nice sample of breast cancer survivors with really good measures. So we'll be able to answer a lot of the questions that have been bugging us for quite some time now. So my last reference to you two is Bono, back in 1987, said, I don't know where we're going, but we have a crew of people that seem to think they know where we're going. So I personally have a few ideas, but ultimately it's about the people that you're working with, people like Carrie, people like Marnie, and people like Steve. You work in these large collaborative groups, and when we all put our heads together, I think we can come up with some good ideas and how to solve some of these issues. So just a few acknowledgements because I'm talking about my research. So I'm funded by the Canada Research Chairs Program and Alberta Innovates Health Solutions. And of course, I want to acknowledge all the people I've worked with, colleagues and friends from both in Alberta, across Canada, the US, and I've got quite a few in Australia that I work with as well. And then of course, graduate students and staff that have helped me get through some of these studies that we've been doing. Thank you.